How do you kill a dragon? Well, if you ask the Dornish, the answers with a well-placed scorpion bolt to the eye, considering it's the only part of a dragon that isn't covered in metal-hard scales. But luck plays a massive role in succeeding with such a weapon, so the better option is to use another dragon. Dragons killed dragons all the time, even in Valyria, for the dragon lords would fight amongst themselves in brutal and bloody civil wars. But there's only one dragon that has such a reputation for killing others, that it's named after its eating habits. The Cannibal is one of the oldest and largest wild dragons living on Dragonstone, and some say he's even older than Balerion. But is that true? And how big and powerful is this guy? And why does he exclusively eat dragons? We'll answer all that and more in this video, so keep your spoiler guard handy, cause this one will be a bumpy ride. Before we get into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Birth and breed. How old is the Cannibal really? Let's dive into the biggest question that most of the fandom has when it comes to this guy. How old is the Cannibal really? He's described as being the oldest and largest of the wild dragons living on Dragonstone. But that's a pretty vague answer. How old is oldest? How large is largest? We don't know, but we can make a few educated guesses. Let's keep the size stuff for later on, because we will be talking about it, and focus on his age here. We might not know the exact age of all the wild dragons on Dragonstone, but we do know roughly how old one of them is. Sheepstealer, the second largest wild dragon behind the Cannibal, is said to have been born when the Old King was still young. The Old King here is King Jaehaerys Targaryen, also known as the Conciliator. Jaehaerys gave the House of the Dragon its longest and most powerful reign, and none reached his heights before or after him. He was born in the year 34 AC and officially took charge in the year 50 AC, so it's possible Sheepstealer was born sometime during this period, or shortly after Jaehaerys reached maturity, or in the first 10 years of his reign. Either way, by the time the Dance of the Dragons begins, Sheepstealer has spent 7 to 8 decades on Dragonstone, which makes the Cannibal closer to a century old at the very least. He's older than Vermithor, who was born shortly after Jaehaerys himself. He's older than Dreamfire, who was born about half a decade before the Old King. He could have been of an age with Quicksilver, the hatchling of King Aenys Targaryen that grew as large as a quarter of Balerion size, but many think he's even older than that, coming to the Isle of Dragonstone even before the Targaryens arrived. People seem to believe in this claim made by the small folk and fishermen of Dragonstone, because it explains the Cannibal's feeding habits, and indeed there is a possibility that he might be older than all the Targaryen dragons born post-conquest, but we're not sure about the pre-conquest stuff, mostly because if Cannibal were that old, he'd have been far larger than Fire and Blood gives him credit for being. We know that dragons don't stop growing until they're near the end of their lives. Balerion himself was said to have kept growing until 93 AC, a year before he passed away. The Black Dread had become slow and lazy for 4 decades before that, and in 56 AC, he returned to King's Landing after a joyride to Valyria, where he sustained wounds so terrible that it scared Jaehaerys' court to think what could have done such a thing to Balerion. But he kept growing nonetheless, and no dragon reached its size or age, not even Vhagar. Balerion had come to Westeros from Valyria as a young dragon, and there's no reliable way of dating his age pre-Dragonstone, but after his arrival, he spent 208 years on Planetos. At the time of her passing, Vhagar is about 3 decades shy of that number, and she still is only said to be as large as Balerion was at the time of the conquest. It's likely that Vhagar was of a different breed to Balerion, which made her grow in a different direction, but even so, the Cannibal should be the largest dragon in existence if he's older than her. The Dance of the Dragons begins 129 years after Aegon's coronation at Old Town. The Targaryens arrived at Dragonstone 114 years before that. That's 240 years, which would put his age at roughly around the same range as Balerion's, if not older. Even if he was from a different breed of dragon, he should have still been called the largest dragon at the time of the dance on account of the factors we've just listed, and yet that title is given to Vhagar time and again. Sure, you can argue that the contents of that section of Fire and Blood come from green-aligned sources, and those sources would have all the reason in the world to big up their dragon. But we don't think they'd lie about dragon size, something that other people can clearly see and perceive and record across various locations. So yes, in a way, the small folk of Dragonstone are correct in saying that the Cannibal is older than the Targaryen dragons. The asterisk there is that he's older than Targaryen dragons born after the conquest. If he were older than Balerion and Vhagar, we'd be able to tell, because older dragons seem to need a lot of encouragement to get them off their butts. And yet the Cannibal is described as a vicious, ill-tempered creature that is as active active as any other wild dragon on Dragonstone. His coloring is reminiscent of the guy people keep comparing him to. Aegon is described as being black as coal, which immediately makes us think of the Black Dread, but his eyes are a menacing green, which makes us think not of dragonfire, but wildfire instead. His flames and egg must have followed a similar coloring pattern, as is the case for all dragons. He must have been hatched in the hatcheries of Dragonstone, but once he was old enough to take care of himself, he made his lair in a cavern at the back of the Dragonmont, on the eastern side. It's tough to determine what breed he belonged to, but it's possible that he was a war-type dragon, based on his behavior. At the start of the dance, if there's one dragon that both sides would want to tie down for themselves, it's the Cannibal, not only because of its ferocity, but also its sheer size. Size comparison. Vhagar versus Vermithor versus Cannibal. We're never told in explicit terms just how large the Cannibal is, but considering it's larger than Sheepstealer, we can rest assured that he's at least going to be the third biggest dragon we see in House of the Dragon, if not second. The confusion regarding this arises from the fact that we have Vhagar and Vermithor both gunning for the top spot, and the Bronze Fury has caught up to the hoary old bitch rather quickly. Vermithor was born about 7 to 8 decades after Vhagar, and yet he's already larger than Dreamfire, who was born around the same time as him. This is definitely thanks to his breed, because the contextual clues about his size and shape all suggest that he's a war-type dragon. That would explain why he's much larger than Dreamfire and Sheepstealer, who are close to his age, but described as slender and skinny, respectively. But the Cannibal has been confirmed to be larger than the latter, and if Dreamfire and Sheepstealer have roughly the same size, which they should, then Cannibal likely matches Vermithor in size, considering his age. Fire and Blood tells us that the Bronze Fury was massive, even as a young dragon, with only Balerion and Vhagar being bigger than him by 48 AC. Like we discussed in the previous section, dragons keep growing as long as they have the freedom to do so. Right now, the Greens have the largest one in existence, but if one of the Blacks were to claim Vermithor, they'd have a dragon more suited to matching her in battle. We saw from the last episode that Meleys, despite her enormity, was only about half the size of Vhagar. Vermithor should easily be at least 2/3 Vhagar's size, if not closer. Vhagar will still be the largest dragon we ever see on screen, unless the Aegon the Conqueror series gets fast-tracked. But that's speaking of Targaryen dragons. When you consider all dragons in Westeros as a whole, the one that should actually be closer to her size than any other dragon is the Cannibal. The Cannibal is much older than Vermithor and Sheepstealer, the next two great dragons from a size and age perspective. If he's a war-type dragon, like we speculated in the previous section, then there's no doubt in our minds that he's bigger than both of them. He might even be Vhagar's equal, because war-type dragons tend to outgrow speed-type dragons. They're often described as being huge and heavy, as opposed to nimble and slender. Unfortunately, we do not have a physical description of the Cannibal, so there's no way of telling whether he's a speed type or a war type. But if he were to be claimed, he would instantly shift the balance of power in favor of whoever rode him. The Blacks are currently thinking about finding riders for the riderless dragons on Dragonstone. While 3 of them are fairly mid-sized, those being Seasmoke, Grey Ghost, and Silverwing, the other 3, Vermithor, Sheepstealer, and the Cannibal, were large enough to redo Aegon's conquest by themselves. Even one of them backing up Meleys at Rook's Rest would have ended the green thread in its cradle, and if the Cannibal was to be that one dragon, then Aegon wouldn't have survived Aemon's treachery. Conversely, if the Greens somehow got their hands on Cannibal, all hopes of countering Vhagar would get dashed for the Blacks, because now they'd have 2 massive dragons to worry about. The Cannibal is definitely the strongest candidate for any dragon seed to claim, but they won't be able to for a simple reason. Can anyone bond with the Cannibal? Like we've explained in most of our dragon anatomy videos, the dragon bond is a highly spiritual and esoteric affair that, if established early on in a dragon's life, could do wonders for taming them. Dragons that have bonded with riders before often turn out to be more docile in later years. For instance, both Jaehaerys and Alysanne's dragons had grown so accustomed to the presence of humans that by the end of their lives, they were completely fine with them. Alysanne's dragon became so docile, in fact, that it did not participate in any wars. And even when it does in House of the Dragon, we will learn with time that dragons do not attack without command when bonded. Even after they lose their riders, the remnants of those human interactions linger, and it makes it easier for future generations to claim the same dragon. Balerion the Black Dread had likely seen half a dozen riders before Aegon the Conqueror, with Daenys the Dreamer probably being one of them. He was claimed by half the number after the conquest, and none of his riders are said to have had difficulties in bonding with him, despite his fierce nature and history. Caraxes was named the Bloodworm long before he became Daemon's mount, and his first rider was Daemon's uncle, Aemon Targaryen. In fact, every Targaryen dragon that was born before Viserys' coronation will end up seeing at least 2 riders in their lifetimes by the end of the series. The only ones that will never have had one will be 2 of the 3 wild dragons. We'll talk about the one that doesn't get claimed in their video specifically, but suffice it to say for now that taming Sheepstealer will be the hardest thing that the dragon seeds will attempt to do during the sowing. He's said to kill as many people as the other unclaimed dragons combined, but that's only because people actually try to claim him. None make a move for the cannibal, because they know that it's going to be a pointless struggle. Even before the Dance of the Dragons, it's said that a dozen would-be dragon tamers tried subduing the cannibal, and now his lair was littered with their corpses. This happened before the dragon seeds were even relevant to Rhaenyra's war strategy, before the sowing became a thing. So who were these dragon tamers? That matters little, but what we can say is that they weren't members of the royal family. We know the fate of every Targaryen born after Aegon's conquest, and none of them died by dragon flame on their ancestral island. Aegon's son Aenys died at Dragonstone of a health issue, and his other son Maegor was the rider of Balerion when the Iron Throne killed him. All of Aenys' children died natural deaths, except Prince Aegon, who was killed in battle by his uncle, and Princess Vela, who died in the cradle. Jaehaerys and Alysanne were more blessed in that nearly half of their children lived into adulthood, but the other half died too early, and most importantly, in front of witnesses. Also, the old king outlived his wife and all his children, save one, who lived across the narrow sea by the time he died. Now, 2 of his 3 grandchildren are dead. Rest in peace, Rhaenys. And the 3rd will likely die soon as well. But all of these Targaryens' lives and deaths were closely observed and recorded by their maesters, lords, ladies-in-waiting, and whoever else could read and write and wanted to document history. None have ever been claimed to have died because they tried to bond with the cannibal, which can only mean that the folks who attempted that madness were either dragon seeds that knew of their heritage, or people crazy enough to think they can tame dragons without the blood of a dragon. How they would climb into his lair, said to be located at the back of the Dragonmont, we don't know. We would assume that the Targaryens would have stationed men to guard the volcano, considering it has valuable resources, and is where the dragons live. But then again, we only hear of the Order of the Dragon Keepers being created during Jaehaerys' reign, so if people tried to tame the cannibal before that, it's likely they'd have faced lighter security. If they did it after, they were certified mad lads, and they have our respect for life, because the cannibal is the one wild dragon no one has any hope of bonding with. The longer a dragon is left to its own devices, the wilder it becomes. Wild dragons are called wild not because they live in jungles, but because, like wild animals, they have wills of their own. If anyone had been vigilant enough to notice its black and green egg hatching when it did, they'd have successfully prevented a dozen human deaths and countless dragon ones. Heck, if they'd managed to locate the cannibal and bond with it as a hatchling or even a young dragon, it would have worked. The moment he crossed the threshold of adulthood, that hope became bleak. And if he's older than a century, that hope is non-existent. You could say that maybe one could Pavlov the cannibal into bonding with them, because that's what will happen to one of the other 2 wild dragons. Sheepstealer accepts her rider only because the rider understands the dragon's taste for mutton, and exploits it until it bends its neck. Grey Ghost is younger than Sheepstealer, and much younger than the cannibal. He could have been claimed without using fish as bait, but if you did, you'd probably stand a better chance of drawing him out of his shell. But with the cannibal, you can't even do that much, because this damn menace eats dragons for its meals. That would be akin to firing a bullet to dodge a bullet, and that kind of thing only works in the Wanted franchise. Besides, why would the Targaryens want to use the very source of their power to bond with a known cannibal dragon? They could just bond with the hatchlings instead, and that would work out way better for them, because, like we mentioned, the earlier the dragon bond is established, the better it is for both rider and dragon. So no, bonding with the cannibal is out of the question. But this brings us neatly to our next segment. Why does the cannibal eat only dragons? Why did the Targaryens never try to kill it? The feeding habits of the 3 wild dragons are mentioned in a rather offhanded fashion in Fire and Blood, but they reveal a lot about each dragon's personality if you correlate it to how animals feed in the wild. Each wild dragon's preferred type of food is an extension of its personality in a way. Grey Ghost was said to have feasted on fishes from the Blackwater and the Narrow Sea, being an exceptionally shy dragon that avoided men in their works for years at a time. Sheepstealer had a taste for mutton, and though it was known to eat a sheepdog on occasion, it never hurt the shepherds as long as it was given free rein of their livestock. The cannibal is said to have descended upon the hatcheries of Dragonstone time and again, and gorged himself on dragon eggs, hatchlings, and even young dragons. Douglas Wheatley, the artist for Fire and Blood, drew an illustration of the cannibal feeding in its lair, and to call it unsettling would be an understatement. With dozens of skulls strewn about its feet and a young dragon clenched between its jaws, you can tell this dragon takes real pleasure in what he's doing. The cannibal could have chosen beef or pork as its preferred meat of choice. The Kingswood had no shortage of stags and boars, so it could have taken that route as well. Instead, it chose to cannibalize its own kind for decades on end, and the reason behind it is quite unclear. Many in the fandom seem to believe that it's because because the cannibal descends from a lineage of dragons that is separate from the Targaryen dragons. This ties into the whole cannibal older than Balerion argument, where people claim that this creature was born from an egg belonging to the dragon lords that owned Dragonstone before the Targaryens. There's some merit to this argument, for it does explain why the cannibal is so antagonistic toward the Targaryen dragons. The ancient dragon lords of Valyria were said to have bred dragons for war, and married in the family to retain control over them. But they're also said to have risen and fallen in an endless tide of political scheming, plotting, and assassinations. Old Valyria was ruled by a freehold, where every landowning family of dragon lords had a say. But in truth, some families were much stronger than others, and this could be because they monopolized the strongest dragons. If the Valyrians were as treacherous and deceitful as history claims they were, then encoding a genetic hatred for the dragons of other dragon lords into their own dragons is something they would be capable of doing. But then again, the Valyrians all cooperated on multiple occasions throughout history to smash their common enemies, and we can't see them doing this if hatred towards other dragons were encoded into their dragon's genes. For example, it's said that during the Second Spice War, the Valyrians sent 300 dragons to respond to the Rhoynar prince Garen the Great and his army of 250,000 Rhoynish soldiers. You can say that the Valyrians kept their egos aside and cooperated for big wars, and then went right back to their internal ones. But the man is not the dragon, as much as the series wants you to believe otherwise. If the dragons themselves were bred with an internal hatred for the lineages of other dragons, it would have brought the doom of Valyria 1,000 years before it arrived. And besides, we seriously doubt that the cannibal belonged to whoever sold Dragonstone to the Targaryens, for reasons we've already explained. So how does it eat dragons, and why have the Targaryens never tried to kill it? For some reason. Two birds, one stone. Dragon birth control. Cannibalism has no proper reason in most species of creatures except amphibians, where it's disturbingly common. You wouldn't think a frog would be cannibalistic, but trust us when we say you do not want to Google how tadpoles become wood frogs. However, it's still a commonly observed phenomenon, and it can occur due to one of two broad reasons. The first is good old nutrition shortage. Most animals, including reptiles, cannibalize their own kind, either because they're not getting the nutrients they need, or because they're so hungry, thanks to their diet, that it's the only source of nutrition they can find. You will see lizards eating lizards, snakes eating snakes, cats eating cats all the time in nature. While it's rare in that it's not the norm, it does happen more frequently than you'd think, and hunger is speculated to be one reason. The other is birth control, and this is where things get dark and disturbing. Certain species of birds are known to drop bad eggs out of their nest because they don't want to waste time and resources on a weak kid. Cats have been observed eating their own young shortly after they're born, either out of hunger or birth control impulse or both. When it comes to the cannibal, it would make sense why he eats dragons and why the Targaryens haven't done anything to him. Because he's doing the family a great service. Think about it. If the cannibal hadn't been regularly cleaning up the hatcheries of Dragonstone, it would have been overrun with dragons, and we know the Targaryens didn't have nearly enough family members to claim them all. A single wild dragon could waylace to an entire coastline, and a dozen wild dragons could burn a country. The cannibal likely acquired its taste for dragon flesh when it was young. It could be that it wasn't as good of a hunter as a hatchling, so it chose to feed on its own kind, and ended up developing a taste for dragon. But because of this taste, he also kept the dragon population in check, and this was very important for the Targaryen family. During the reign of King Jaehaerys, 3 dragon eggs are stolen from Dragonmont and allegedly sold to the Sea Lord of Braavos. The old king is deeply concerned by this development, because he doesn't want dragons to fall into the hands of anyone besides his own family. If Targaryen blood was the only way that dragons could be born, why would the old king stress over the theft of these eggs? Unless, of course, it wasn't Targaryen blood that was specifically required, but rather blood of the dragon. In the main series, a sellsword called Brown Ben Plum is liked by Dany's dragon, even though his relationship to the Targaryens is distant and ancient. And you guys already know the entire premise of the dragon seeds by now. Most of Western Essos is populated by people whose ancestors were taken, defiled, or consensually copulated by the Valyrians. Hell, it's said that the citizens of Lys looked the closest to the dragon lords of old, apart from the Targaryens themselves. But if these eggs hatched elsewhere and the dragons born from them bonded with a person of Valyrian blood, then it would break the Targaryen monopoly on dragons. Besides, Jaehaerys was known to have taken great interest in the scrolls that his ancestors brought from Valyria before the Doom, and he must have surely read somewhere that the secret of the dragon bond was possessing dragon's blood. Thankfully, he doesn't have to worry about those missing eggs in his lifetime, and no dragons appear until Daenerys revives them. But this can explain why the cannibal was allowed to live, despite being a scourge to the Targaryens' greatest resource. By the time those eggs went missing, Vermithor was large enough to challenge the cannibal. If the old king wanted to, he could have taken it upon himself to kill it, and let dragons populate the skies of Dragonstone like they once did in old Valyria. But he didn't, because he knew the House of the Dragon needed to be kept close-knit, and he also knew that someone had to keep the dragons safe from themselves. That's where the cannibal's appetite for its own kind comes from. and why House Targaryen tolerated it for as long as he lived. Without him, they'd have more dragons than dragon lords on their hands, and we don't need to explain why that would be a problem now, do we? But having explained the cannibal's age, size, feeding habits, and bonding status, let's take a look at what he will do as part of the House of the Dragon. What's the cannibal's ultimate fate? Can it kill Vhagar or Vermithor? If the cannibal were to be claimed, he could definitely kill Vhagar or Vermithor, maybe even both. Sure, his practice of selecting a choice form of protein that's similar to his own DNA signature could have stunted his growth to an extent, as cannibalism is wont to do in real life, but the fact that he's kept at it without getting claimed or even harmed as far as we know of is a testament to how powerful the cannibal is. With the right rider and the right circumstance, he could jump either of the two biggest dragons in the world and wouldn't feel out of place. But sadly, the cannibal will see no fighting action. He will show up during the sowing, but only as a reminder of his own ferocity. When Silver Denys tries to bond with Sheepstealer, the dragon takes his arm, but the cannibal takes his life and that of his sons, after driving Sheepstealer away. Later, when Sunfire kills Grey Ghost, it's speculated that it was the cannibal that did it instead, considering his nature and Grey Ghost's age. Grey Ghost was a young dragon at the time of the dance, and everyone on Dragonstone, including its Castell and Robert Quince, knew that that was how the cannibal liked his meals. Baela Targaryen offers to go check out the scene herself, claiming Moondancer can outfly Cannibal should she get into trouble, but she's forbidden from doing so, on account of the latter's savage nature. It's only when the sailors of Nassaria insisted that the dragon who fought Grey Ghost had golden scales that Sunfire's participation in the matter was revealed, and that would be the last time the cannibal would be relevant to the story. After the conclusion of the dance, it's said that the cannibal saluted the corpse of the sea snake as it rose out of the dragon mount, but that's likely a poetic fabrication instead of factual reporting. What is factual is that the cannibal vanished from Dragonstone sometime after the dance, and we don't know where he went. Our guess would be Valeria, for all dragons came from Valeria, or perhaps Ashai, the secret city which is said to be their true point of origin. All we know is that when he disappeared, dragons vanished from the Dragonmont altogether, and none of the Targaryen eggs hatched afterward. It's possible that Cannibal abandoned Dragonstone precisely because of that reason. Every subsequent generation of Targaryens following the dance was presented with a dragon's egg in their cradles, but none hatched, because they'd become fossilized. If this happened at Dragonstone too, then the cannibal had just lost his food supply. The only place where he could hope to find dragons are Valeria and Ashai, so that's where he must have gone. Regardless, it's a damn shame we'll never see him fight another dragon, because we want to see those black and green flames in action at least once. But at least now we've uncovered most of the mysteries surrounding his anatomy, eh? Marvelous verdict. And with that, we've also arrived at the end of this video. Let us know your thoughts on the cannibal and who should have claimed him, if anyone, down in the comments section. Hit that subscribe bell if you haven't already, and give us a like while you're at it. It really helps out. Share it with your fellow Throneheads, and we'll see you all in the next one. Until then, don't forget, history is written in fire and blood. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone.